During a quiet dinner with my son, my phone suddenly buzzed. A text message from my other child made my heart skip a beat. "Get up and leave now. Don't say anything to the kid." I looked up at my son sitting across from me, still eating normally like nothing had happened. Why would his brother send such a cryptic message? Why was I being ordered to stay silent with my own child during our family dinner? Have you ever discovered a painful truth about your loved ones? Please share your feelings in the comments below. When I stepped outside following the message, what I witnessed through the window made me realize I'd been living in denial this whole time. The children I loved most in this world might have been treating me like an enemy. The smell of grilled meat filled the dining room, just the way Martha used to cook it every Sunday for 35 years. I was sitting across from Jim, my youngest at 18, and a college student who usually came home on weekends, watching him pile mashed potatoes onto his fork with the enthusiasm only a kid his age could manage. "You look healthier than last week, Dad," he said, glancing up with those eyes that reminded me so much of his mother. "Lucky Sam is taking care of you." Sam, my eldest son at 32, had moved back home with his wife, Sarah, 29 years old, after Martha died from heart disease 1 year ago. I nodded, feeling that familiar warmth spread through my chest. Maybe I was overthinking things these days. The dining room hadn't changed much since we lost Martha. Same oak table we'd bought together in 1987. Same ceramic plates she'd insisted on for special occasions. Same view of the backyard where I'd spent countless hours teaching both boys how to throw a curveball. Jim was telling me about his classes, about professors who reminded him of me, about how much he missed coming home to Martha's cooking. "Remember when Mom used to make us finish everything on our plates?" he asked, grinning as he cut into his steak. "She'd say the vegetables could see us from the kitchen window, and they'd be disappointed if we wasted them." I chuckled, remembering how Martha could make even Brussels sprouts sound like they had feelings. The house felt different without her laughter echoing through these rooms, but having family around helped fill some of that emptiness. For a moment, I felt like maybe our little family was actually healing from the loss that had torn us apart. That's when my phone buzzed against the wooden table. The sound sliced through our conversation, sharp and urgent. I picked it up, expecting maybe a telemarketer or one of my old courthouse buddies calling to complain about their latest medical drama. Instead, I saw Sam's name on the screen, and the message below it made my heart hammer against my ribs like a frantic, unspoken alarm. "Get up and go. Don't say anything to your son." The words hit me with the force of a gavel striking wood. I stared at those words, reading them twice, then 3 times, trying to make sense of what could possibly be so urgent that it required this level of secrecy. Was this some kind of sick joke? Was Sam in trouble with dangerous people? I looked up at Jim, who was still eating, completely unaware that something had just shifted in our quiet evening like tectonic plates moving beneath the surface of normal life. "Everything okay, Dad?" Jim asked, noticing whatever expression had crossed my face. I forced what I hoped was a reassuring smile, slipping the phone into my pocket like it was evidence of a crime. "Just a call from the old firm," I lied, standing up from the table with legs that suddenly felt unsteady. "A legal matter that needs my eye tonight. You know how those retired folks can't help but feel important about these emergency consultations." The lie came easier than I expected, practiced and smooth, like I'd been preparing for this moment without knowing it. Jim laughed and waved me off with his fork. "Go ahead. I'll clean up the dishes. Take your time with whatever crisis they think only you can solve." I headed toward the front door, my mind racing with possibilities. None of them good. What could be so important that Sam couldn't just pick up the phone and call me like a normal person? As I stepped outside into the cool evening air, I could hear Jim's voice drifting through the dining room window behind me. But something in his tone made me stop dead in my tracks, made every instinct I'd developed during 30 years of courtroom experience start screaming warnings. Gone was the warm, casual voice from our dinner conversation just moments before. Now he sounded cold, businesslike, urgent in a way that made my stomach clench like a fist. "He just left," Jim was saying into what must have been his phone. "Are you done yet?" The words felt like ice water in my veins, like discovering that the ground you thought was solid had been quicksand all along. I pressed myself against the side of the house, hidden in the shadows of Martha's old rose bushes that she'd planted the year we bought this place. Through the dining room window, I could see Jim pacing back and forth, still talking on his phone with an urgency that had nothing to do with college classes or weekend visits. That's when I saw them moving through my house like they owned it. Sam and Sarah were coming down the stairs, carrying boxes and moving with the quiet efficiency of people who didn't want to be heard. Martha's old jewelry box was clutched in Sarah's hands, the same wooden box with brass corners that held the pearl necklace I'd given my wife for our 20th anniversary. "We need to clear out the last of this clutter," Sarah was saying to Sam, as they headed toward what I assumed was their car. Sam nodded, glancing around nervously like a man afraid of getting caught in the act. "Just be quick about it. I don't want him coming back and asking questions we can't answer." I stood there in the darkness, looking through that window at my sons like they were complete strangers, people I'd never met before in my life. Maybe I should have seen this coming? Maybe a man doesn't survive 30 years on the bench without learning to spot when someone's playing him for a fool? But apparently grief makes even smart men blind to the truth right in front of their faces. I wondered if I really knew who my children were, or if I'd been living with strangers who wore familiar faces. I didn't go home that night. Instead, I drove my old Ford pickup to the Hampton Inn about 15 minutes away, the same place Martha and I used to stay when we wanted a weekend getaway without actually leaving town. The desk clerk, a young woman with tired eyes, looked at me strangely when I showed up without luggage, paying cash for a room like some kind of criminal on the run. In the sterile quiet of that hotel room, I sat on the edge of the bed staring at the generic landscape painting on the wall, trying to piece together what I'd witnessed. 30 years on the bench taught me the truth has a way of surfacing, but only if you dig for it. I needed to start digging. All night, I replayed moments from the past few months, searching for clues I'd been too trusting or too grief-stricken to recognize. Sam moving back in after Martha's funeral, claiming he wanted to take care of Dad during this difficult time. Sarah's tight smiles whenever I entered a room, the way conversation seemed to stop when I walked into the kitchen like I'd interrupted something important. Jim's weekend visits that suddenly felt more like inspections than family time, the way he'd ask casual questions about my health, my memory, my plans for the future. Had I been so desperate for family connection that I'd missed all the warning signs? I thought I was overthinking things. Turns out I wasn't overthinking enough. The next morning brought a memory that hit me like evidence I should have recognized months ago. 2 weeks earlier, Sam had approached me in my study, holding my bank card in his hand, with that concerned son expression he'd apparently perfected. "Let me manage this for convenience, Dad," he'd said, sitting down in the same chair where he used to do his homework as a boy. "You just relax and rest, focus on healing from losing Mom. Let me handle all the financial stuff so you don't have to worry about complicated transactions anymore." I'd been touched by his thoughtfulness, grateful to have one less burden during the worst period of my life. Now I wondered what kind of fool I'd been to hand over control so easily. I drove straight to First National Bank as soon as they opened, my hands gripping the steering wheel tight enough to leave marks. The bank manager, a man I'd known for over a decade, greeted me with his usual warm smile that faltered the moment I asked about recent withdrawals from my account. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, avoiding eye contact as he pulled up my records on his computer screen. "Your son informed us the withdrawals were for home repairs," he said simply, but his tone carried the weight of unspoken questions. $3,000 for repairs? I walked through that house every single day, and the only thing that needed fixing was the squeaky hinge on the back door that had been squeaking since the Clinton administration. When I called Jim from the bank parking lot, his voice had that careful quality people use when they're walking through a minefield of their own making. "Dad, maybe you should think about finding your own place," he said, without any build-up or explanation. The words hung in the air between us like a verdict I hadn't seen coming. "You know, so everyone can be more comfortable living their own lives." More comfortable? I'd lived in that house for 28 years, raised both boys there, carried Martha over the threshold as a bride, and held her hand as she died in our bedroom upstairs. The abruptness of his suggestion carried more weight than any explanation could have provided. My youngest child, the boy I'd taught to ride a bicycle in our driveway, was telling me to leave my own home. Driving back toward the house, I saw a middle-aged couple standing in my front yard with Sam, pointing at the windows and nodding as he talked like a real estate agent showing a prime property. They were dressed nicely, the kind of people who had money to spend, and they were looking at my house like they were already planning where to put their furniture. I parked across the street and watched as Sam gestured toward the property, with the enthusiasm of a man making a sale he'd been working on for months. When they shook hands, I heard Sam say something that made my blood turn to ice. "You can move in next month, assuming everything goes according to plan." That's when I heard Sarah's voice from the front porch, clear as a bell in the evening air. "You promised he would leave quietly, right? I don't want any trouble or drama when this happens." Sam nodded and handed the couple a folded paper that looked suspiciously like a contract. They looked it over, smiled like people who'd just gotten the deal of a lifetime, and headed back to their expensive car with satisfied expressions. As I watched them drive away, I understood with perfect clarity that I wasn't a father to these people anymore. I was just an obstacle that needed to be removed from a transaction they'd already completed. The children I loved most in my life had treated me like a problem to be solved, not a person to be respected. The house I'd built, the life I'd created, the family I'd devoted everything to, it was all just business to them now. And I was the only one who didn't know the deal had already been made. Maybe I should have seen it coming, but grief has a way of making even smart men believe what they want to believe, instead of what's right in front of their faces. I sat in my truck across from my own home, watching strangers discuss their future in my front yard, and realized that the children I'd raised had become people I didn't recognize at all. The pain was clinical, like reading a verdict I never expected. My heart wasn't breaking, it was calculating. By the time I was sitting in my truck watching strangers discuss moving into my home, something cold and methodical had taken over. Something that felt familiar from my years on the bench. I'd spent 3 decades working fraud cases, unraveling lies, finding truth buried under layers of deception and misdirection. Maybe I was just a grieving widower to my sons, but I was still a judge at heart. And judges don't give up when they smell something rotten, even when the rot is coming from their own family tree. The house felt like a crime scene when I finally went inside that evening, every corner holding secrets I'd been too blind to see. Every family photo looked like evidence of a lie I'd been too trusting to recognize. I went straight to my study, to the same rollback desk where I'd graded law school papers and reviewed case files for decades. In the bottom drawer, behind old tax returns and insurance documents that smelled like dust and forgotten promises, I found the stack of papers Sam had given me to sign after Martha's funeral. The memory came flooding back with painful clarity. "Just sign these, Dad?" he'd said with tears in his eyes that I now questioned. "Insurance paperwork, inheritance procedures, bank documents, legal stuff that Mom would have handled. I'll take care of everything so you don't have to worry about any of it during this difficult time." I'd signed them all without reading carefully, because I was drowning in grief, barely able to function, let alone navigate the maze of legal paperwork that follows death like vultures. Sam had seemed so concerned, so responsible, taking charge when his old man couldn't think straight. Now I spread those papers across my desk like evidence in a murder trial, looking for the weapon that had been used against me. Most of it was exactly what Sam had claimed. Standard forms and procedures that any family would need to handle after losing someone. But buried in the middle, hidden between legitimate documents like a forgery and a stack of real bills, was something that made my hands shake with cold rage. A power of attorney document that gave Sam comprehensive authority to make all financial decisions regarding my property, my accounts, my entire life's work. The signature at the bottom was definitely mine, but I had no memory of understanding what I was signing. The document itself was the evidence I needed. Arthur, he planned this very carefully. The papers were prepared well in advance. The next morning, I called an old friend who'd been practicing law since we were both young idealists fresh out of school. When I spread those papers on his conference table, his expression confirmed what I already suspected. "Arthur, he planned this very carefully," he said simply, and those words carried the weight of a professional opinion that would hold up in any court. The papers were prepared well in advance. That single, powerful line eliminated any doubt about my son's intentions. This wasn't a desperate response to circumstances. It was a carefully orchestrated plan that had been in motion long before I realized I was the target. But the real revelation came when I was cleaning out Martha's nightstand that evening. Something I'd been putting off for months, because touching her things made the loss feel fresh all over again. At the bottom of the drawer, beneath her reading glasses and old prayer books that still smelled like her perfume, I found her diary. Martha had kept a journal for as long as I'd known her, writing in it every night before bed like clockwork. I'd never read it, respecting her privacy even in death. But something made me open it to the last entry, with fingers that felt like they belonged to someone else. Her handwriting was shaky, weaker than usual. The letters formed with the careful effort of someone fighting against time itself. The entry was dated just 3 days before she died, and the words made my chest tight with recognition. Sam asked me about the property values again today. He said it was for planning purposes, but the look in his eyes felt different. This wasn't a direct warning or an accusation. It was the intuitive concern of a wife who knew her son better than he knew himself. Martha had sensed something was wrong without being able to put her finger on exactly what it was. I flipped back through earlier entries, my heart pounding like I was uncovering evidence in the most important case of my career. There was another entry, more specific and troubling. Arthur was napping when Sam came by this afternoon. He asked me detailed questions about the insurance policies, about what would happen if something happened to you before me. The conversation felt rehearsed, like he'd been thinking about these questions for a long time. This showed a progression in Martha's suspicion, a pattern of behavior that she'd been documenting without realizing she was building a case against her own son. I held that diary with trembling hands, Martha's words blurring through my tears. My wife had known something was wrong, had felt the shift in Sam's behavior even when I was too trusting to see it. She'd sensed the calculation behind his questions, the planning behind his casual inquiries about our finances and our future. Martha had tried to warn me from beyond the grave, leaving breadcrumbs of truth in her diary, like evidence for a trial that would come after her death. The woman who'd shared my bed for over 30 years had seen what I'd been too loving, too grief-stricken to recognize. Our son was planning something that didn't include our permission or our knowledge. I needed more information, and I knew exactly where to get it. Sam's college roommate worked for a real estate company downtown, had been to our house plenty of times over the years for barbecues and birthday parties. He seemed like a decent young man, the kind who'd probably feel guilty about keeping secrets from an old family friend. I called him that morning, trying to sound casual and friendly despite the storm brewing in my chest. "Just wondering if Sam ever mentioned anything about real estate investments," I said, keeping my voice light and conversational. There was a long, uncomfortable silence on the other end of the line that told me everything I needed to know before he even spoke. "Mr. Arthur, I probably shouldn't say anything, but Sam contacted our office about 6 months ago," he said finally. "He said you were interested in selling the land behind your house." My grip tightened on the phone until my knuckles went white. The memory hit me instantly. 2 years ago, a developer had approached us about buying the 3 acres behind our house for luxury condominiums. They'd offered us $1.5 million for land we'd bought for $30,000 back in 1979. I'd refused without thinking twice, because that ground held too many memories. Too many summer evenings where Martha and I had talked about growing old together watching the sunrise. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop near his office, and when I sat down across from him, I could see the discomfort written all over his young face. "Sam told us you'd agreed to sell the land for $1.5 million, he said quietly. He brought in legal documents showing he had power of attorney, said you'd developed memory problems and couldn't handle complex financial transactions anymore. Honestly, Mr. Arthur, we felt bad for him. He seemed really torn up about your condition." Memory problems? I'd been making complex legal decisions when this kid was worried about passing high school algebra. Sam had systematically destroyed my reputation, painted me as a confused old man whose children had to step in to protect him from his own failing mind. "There's something else you should know," the young man added. glancing around like he was afraid someone might overhear. "Sam already signed a preliminary contract with the buyers. We're supposed to transfer the money next month as soon as the final paperwork clears." The coffee tasted bitter in my mouth as I realized the full scope of what my son had orchestrated. He hadn't just planned to steal my property. He'd made sure everyone would think it was necessary, that poor Sam was just doing what needed to be done for his declining father. Every handshake, every conversation, every moment of seeming concern had been part of a careful strategy to isolate me and take everything I'd worked for. Driving back home, I felt like I was seeing my entire life from the outside for the first time. My own son had not only planned to steal my property, he'd made sure my reputation would survive the theft by making me the victim who needed protecting. But the bigger question was eating at me like acid. Why did Sam need so much money so desperately? What was so urgent that he'd risk destroying his relationship with his father forever? I thought I knew my children, thought I understood their motivations and their character. Apparently, I'd been wrong about everything. The next day brought another discovery that turned everything I thought I understood upside down. I was going through old bank statements with the methodical attention I used to give important court cases when I noticed something that made no sense at all. Over the past year, Sam had made several large deposits into his own account, deposits that coincided perfectly with withdrawals from mine. But there were also massive withdrawals from Sam's account, enormous amounts of money going to places I didn't recognize. Medical billing companies, private hospitals, specialized treatment centers that charged more per day than most people made in a month. I stared at the computer screen, cross-referencing dates and amounts, trying to piece together a timeline that would explain what I was seeing. Sam was stealing from me systematically, but he was also spending incredible amounts of money on medical expenses that seemed to have no connection to anything I knew about our family's health. The withdrawals from his account were staggering, far more than he could have taken from my accounts, which meant he was getting money from other sources too. Sources that might not be as patient or understanding as a father who'd been kept in the dark about everything. The numbers on the screen started to blur as the implications hit me. Medical bills for what? Treatment for whom? The dates corresponded with the last few months of Martha's illness, when Sam had suddenly found specialists and experimental treatments that insurance wouldn't cover. I'd wanted to help pay for everything, had offered to liquidate my retirement accounts, but Sam had insisted he could handle the financial arrangements himself. "You've done enough for this family, Dad," he'd said with what I now realized might have been desperate pride rather than simple devotion. "Let me take care of this. Let me be the one who saves Mom this time." Medical bills? I stared at the screen, the numbers blurring together like evidence in a case I was afraid to solve. What in God's name was Sam paying for? And if he'd borrowed money to cover expenses that even my stolen funds couldn't handle, who exactly was he in debt to? And what would they do if he couldn't pay them back? The picture forming in my mind was darker than simple greed, more complicated than I'd prepared myself to understand. My son wasn't just a thief. He might be a desperate man whose good intentions had led him down a path he couldn't find his way back from. I couldn't take the uncertainty anymore. Couldn't sleep another night wondering what game my children were playing with my life. I called Jim and told him to come home that evening, using the tone I'd perfected during 30 years of commanding courtroom respect. "We need to have a family meeting," I said. and something in my voice must have convinced him not to argue or make excuses. When he arrived, I was sitting in the living room with Martha's diary in my lap, and a stack of financial documents spread across the coffee table like evidence in a trial. Jim took one look at those papers and his face crumpled. The confident college kid disappearing to reveal the scared boy I remembered. "Dad, I can explain everything," he started. But I held up my hand with the authority of a man who'd spent decades silencing lawyers in mid-sentence. "No more lies, son. I know about the power of attorney. I know about the real estate deal. I know your brother has been systematically draining my bank accounts. What I don't know is why. And you're going to tell me the truth right now." Jim sank into the chair across from me. The same chair where he'd sat as a little boy, when he was in trouble for breaking windows with his baseball. For a moment, all his college sophistication evaporated, leaving behind the child who'd never been good at hiding his emotions. "It's not what you think, Dad," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sam didn't want any of this to happen the way it did." I waited, letting the silence stretch between us like a rope that might hang him or save him, depending on what he did with it. Finally, Jim broke down crying, real tears that reminded me he was still just a kid trying to navigate adult consequences. "Sam borrowed money to take Mom to that private hospital in California," he said through his tears. "The experimental treatment that insurance wouldn't cover, the one that cost more per week than most people make in a year." The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath out of my lungs. I remembered those last few months of Martha's illness, when Sam had suddenly found a specialist who claimed he could help with cases like hers. "This doctor has had remarkable success with patients in Mom's condition," Sam had told me, with hope shining in his eyes. "It's expensive, but what's money compared to Mom's life?" I'd wanted to help pay for everything, had offered to liquidate my retirement accounts, but Sam had insisted he could handle it. Now I understood what that insistence had actually cost him, what sacrifices he'd made that I'd been too blind to see. "But Mom still didn't make it," Jim continued, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "And Sam is drowning in debt to people who don't negotiate payment plans." The pieces were falling into place, but they weren't forming the picture I'd expected when I started this investigation. "Sam thought if he could sell the house and the land, he could pay everyone back and still have enough to buy you a nice place somewhere else. He said it would be easier if you hated him for being greedy than if you knew he'd failed to save Mom despite spending everything." The anger I'd been carrying around like a hot coal was dissolving into something more complicated, something that felt like my heart was being torn between competing loyalties. "Sarah doesn't even know about the debt," Jim continued. "Sam told her he wanted to sell the house to buy you something nicer, more suitable for retirement. She believed him because she loves you too, Dad. She thought this was about taking better care of you." I thought about all those tight smiles, all those conversations that stopped when I entered a room, and realized Sarah had been trying to keep what she thought was a wonderful surprise. "And Dad," Jim said, looking at me with eyes full of pain and fear, "if Sam can't pay back what he owes next month, the people he borrowed from aren't going to just garnish his wages." I used to tell complicated family stories like this on Storytime Chronicles, back when I was practicing law and thought I understood how families could tear themselves apart over money and pride. But I never imagined I'd be sitting in my own living room, discovering that my eldest son had sacrificed everything to try to save his mother, and was too ashamed to ask his father for help when the gamble failed. "How long have you known about this?" I asked Jim, though I already suspected the answer. "Since the beginning," he admitted. unable to meet my eyes. "But Sam made me promise not to tell you. He said you'd blame yourself for not having enough money to save Mom." I had been so consumed by my own grief, I never once looked up to see what my son was sacrificing for us. While I was drowning in self-pity, convinced that my children were vultures waiting for me to die, Sam was bankrupting himself trying to save the woman we both loved. He'd borrowed money from dangerous people because he was too proud to admit he needed help, and was now facing consequences that could destroy his life. Meanwhile, I'd been sitting in this house feeling sorry for myself, completely oblivious to the real crisis unfolding right under my nose. I sat there for a long time, not as a father, not as a victim, but as a judge who had just heard all the evidence. The facts were clear. My son had committed fraud to try to save his mother, had lied to everyone to protect them from the truth, and was now facing consequences that went far beyond money. The law was one thing, but justice was something else entirely. And now, it was time to pass a different kind of verdict, one that took into account not just what Sam had done, but why he'd felt he had no choice but to do it alone. That evening, I demanded all three of them be present at home: Sam, Sarah, and Jim. I didn't tell anyone what I knew or what I planned to say, just insisted that we needed to have a family meeting that couldn't wait another day. Sam arrived first, looking haggard and nervous, like a man who'd been carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders for too long. Sarah came in behind him, confusion written all over her face, clearly wondering why her father-in-law had suddenly called this formal gathering. Jim sat in the corner, unable to meet anyone's eyes, knowing that the secrets he'd been keeping were about to explode in all our faces. I sat in my chair and looked at each of them in turn, saying absolutely nothing. The silence was crushing, filled with guilt and fear and secrets that had been eating away at my family like termites in the foundation. Sam grew more agitated with each passing second, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool evening air. Sarah's confusion was turning to worry as she looked back and forth between her husband and me, sensing something terrible was about to unfold. Finally, when I thought Sam might actually have a heart attack from the stress, he broke down completely. "I'm sorry, Dad," Sam said, his voice cracking under the weight of months of deception. The tears came hard and fast, but these weren't the tears of a child caught in mischief. These were the tears of a man whose pride had been shattered, whose desperate gamble had cost him everything he valued. "I did everything wrong. I lied to you, I stole from you, I tried to force you out of your own house. But I just wanted to save Mom. I thought if I could get her the best treatment, if I could find the right doctors, if I spent enough money I could fix everything." His voice broke completely, and I could see the weight of his failure crushing him like a physical force. Sarah stared at her husband like she was seeing him for the first time in their marriage, her face cycling through shock, confusion, and something that might have been recognition of the depth of his desperation. "What debt?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you talking about, Sam? You told me we were selling the house to buy your father something nicer." Sam looked at his wife with so much pain in his eyes that I almost couldn't watch, could see him realizing that his lies had hurt everyone he loved, not just me. "I borrowed money from dangerous people to pay for experimental treatment for Mom," he admitted, his voice hollow with exhaustion. "I mortgaged our house, liquidated our savings, borrowed against my business. When that wasn't enough, I went to people who don't accept excuses. I stood up slowly and walked to my desk, feeling every one of my 60 years in my bones. From the top drawer, I pulled out a folded paper and returned to my chair, aware that everyone in the room was staring at me, waiting for the explosion, waiting for the judgment that would tear our family apart forever. Instead, I unfolded that yellowed paper and held it up for everyone to see. It wasn't legal documents or court papers or eviction notices. It was a blueprint, faded with age, showing the plans for a small house that had never been built. "Do you remember this, Sam?" I asked, watching recognition dawn in his eyes like sunrise after the longest night. "This is the house I wanted to build for you when you got married, back when you said you wanted to stay close to family instead of moving across the country for that job offer," I continued, my voice steady despite the emotions churning inside me. The blueprint showed a modest but well-designed home, complete with a front porch and a view of the garden where Martha used to grow her prize-winning roses. "I found this in your mother's things. She kept it all these years because she knew that someday we'd want to remember the young man who valued family above everything else, who would rather live in a small house near his parents than a mansion far away from the people he loved." I handed Sam the blueprint, watching him take it with trembling hands. "Here's what we're going to do," I said, using the tone I'd perfected during 3 decades of handing down sentences that changed people's lives. "I'm going to pay off every penny you owe, to everyone you borrowed from, dangerous or otherwise. But in return, you're going to build this house with your own hands. No contractors, no shortcuts, no taking the easy way out. You're going to learn what it means to create something instead of just taking it. To build something that will last instead of just surviving from one crisis to the next." I looked around the room at my family, damaged but not destroyed, hurting but still capable of healing if we were brave enough to try. "And Sarah," I said, turning to my daughter-in-law, "you're going to help him build it, because a marriage needs to be built on truth, not on protection from reality. We're going to start over, all of us, but this time with complete honesty about our problems, our fears, and our love for each other." I sat back down, feeling lighter than I had in months, like a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying had finally been lifted from my shoulders. I looked into the eyes of the child I had misunderstood for a whole year, the son who had loved his mother enough to risk everything, and realized that this was finally the time for a real father to show the kind of love that doesn't count the cost. The new house rose from the ground, slowly, built with their own hands, and a new foundation of honesty. I watched them struggle and succeed, learning to build something new from the ground up. Every morning, I'd pour my coffee and settle into Martha's old chair by the window, watching my son discover what it meant to create instead of just survive. Sam would measure twice and cut once, just like I'd taught him as a boy, while Sarah held boards steady and offered encouragement when frustration threatened to overwhelm him. Jim came home every weekend to help, and gradually our family dinners returned to something resembling normal, though this normal was built on truth instead of comfortable lies. The day I went to pay off Sam's debts was both the hardest and most satisfying day I'd had since Martha's funeral. The men Sam owed money to were polite and professional, but their eyes held a coldness that made me understand why my son had been so terrified of disappointing them. As I signed the check that represented a significant chunk of my retirement savings, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Martha died. Hope for the future. Driving home from that meeting, I realized I wasn't just paying off debt. I was buying back my family's chance to start over without the weight of dangerous secrets crushing everything we tried to rebuild. Over the next few weeks, the truth kept unfolding in small moments that revealed the scope of what Sam had sacrificed. He showed me medical bills that staggered me, loan documents that made my hands shake, letters from creditors who weren't known for their patience or understanding. The amount he owed was more than I'd imagined any one person could accumulate, but what struck me most was the timeline. He'd started setting aside money 6 months before Martha was even officially diagnosed, watching her decline and preparing for a fight he hoped would never come. When the experimental treatment became an option, Sam had already liquidated everything he could legally access and turned to sources that demanded more than money as collateral. The hardest conversation came 3 months into the construction project. Sam and I were sitting on the back porch, watching the sun set behind the frame of his half-built house, when he finally asked the question I knew had been eating at him since Martha's funeral. "Do you think Mom would be proud of what I did?" he said, not looking at me directly. "Spending all that money, lying to everyone I loved, nearly destroying our family just to chase a treatment that didn't even work?" I reached into my shirt pocket and pulled out one of Martha's diary entries, the one I'd started carrying with me like a prayer. Without saying a word, I handed it to him and watched him read his mother's words. Sam read the entry twice, his fingers tracing his mother's handwriting like it was a message sent directly from beyond the grave. The tears that came weren't the desperate sobs of a man whose world was falling apart. They were the quiet tears of someone finding peace after a year of carrying impossible guilt. "She knew what you were doing," I said simply. She was proud to have raised a son who would sacrifice everything for the people he loved, even when the odds were against him. For the first time since Martha's funeral, I saw something like peace settle into his eyes, the kind of peace that comes when a man realizes his mother understood his heart, even when he'd lost sight of it himself. When the house was finally finished 6 months later, Sam handed me the keys with shaking hands and eyes full of unshed tears. It was small but perfect, with large windows facing the garden where Martha used to grow her flowers, and a front porch where I could sit in the evenings and remember all the good times we'd shared as a family. "I'm sorry for not trusting your love," he said as we stood in the doorway of what would become my new home. "I'm sorry for thinking I had to protect you from the truth, for believing that lying was easier than asking for help when everything was falling apart." I hugged my eldest son, feeling him relax against me for the first time in years. "I forgive you," I said, meaning it completely. "But promise me something. Promise me that from now on, when this family has problems, we face them together. Promise me no more secrets, no more protection from reality, no more trying to handle everything alone. Now I live in the small house my son built for me with his own hands, looking out at the garden where Martha used to plant flowers every spring. Every evening, Sam, Sarah, and Jim come over for dinner, and we eat at the same oak table, but the conversations are completely different. We talk about real things now: fears, dreams, money problems, hopes for the future. Sometimes I think about that Friday evening when a simple text message shattered my comfortable illusions and forced me to confront truths I wasn't ready to face. I realize now that it wasn't the message that changed everything. It was my response to it. I could have let pride and hurt feelings destroy what was left of our relationships, but instead I chose to investigate, to understand, to see past my own pain to the larger picture of love and desperation that was driving my family apart. Martha always said that real love requires both firmness and gentleness, knowing when to teach and when to forgive. Real strength came from admitting when you need help, facing problems together, and building something new on the foundation of truth. Man, I gotta be honest with you. Arthur's story really got to me. Here's this guy who thought he had his family all figured out, right? 30 years as a judge, probably saw every kind of lie and manipulation you can imagine, and yet he almost missed the biggest truth of his own life. His son wasn't trying to steal from him. He was drowning trying to save his mother. That's heavy stuff. You ever been so wrong about someone that it kept you up at night? Because I have, and it's not a fun feeling. What really gets me is how Sam felt like he had to carry all that debt, all that guilt, all by himself. Pride's a hell of a thing, isn't it? Sometimes it makes us do stupid things, like borrowing money from dangerous people instead of just asking our dad for help. And Arthur? Poor guy was so caught up in his own grief that he couldn't see his son was falling apart right in front of him. I keep thinking about that text message, you know? Get up and go. What would you have done? Would you have confronted them right then and there? Or would you have dug deeper like Arthur did? Drop a comment and let me know, because honestly, I'm not sure what I would have done. If this story made you feel something, maybe give it a thumbs up so more people can find it. And look, I know times are tough for everyone, but if you've got a few bucks to spare and you appreciate these stories, that little thanks button down there really does help me keep doing this. Anyway, thanks for sticking around through all that family drama. Catch you in the next one, and remember, sometimes the people we think are our enemies are just scared kids who don't know how to ask for help.